Okay, so moving into lesson 3, and we're going to do this over the course of a couple days because it's a lot of acronyms um, and a lot of congruency marks and making sure you have everything you need to prove two triangles congruent. We already know that when two triangles are congruent, we can set those corresponding parts equal and solve equations. But we need to make sure that if we're not told they're congruent, we have enough information to identify that they are congruent. Um, all right, so today we're going to go over 3 ways to do that. The first one is your side, side, side postulate, then side, and angle, side, angle. So these are very specific to the order that they are given. So when we're talking side, 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 you have 3 sides: side, a side, an angle, and then a side. So they go in that order, and that's probably what makes this the most difficult as far as identifying which theorem or postulate is proving triangles congruent. So side, side, side states, right, if the 3 corresponding sides are congruent, and this is in 2 triangles, then the triangles are congruent. So say we have triangle ABC, and then we have triangle QRS, and AB is marked congruent to QR, BC is marked congruent to RS, AC is marked congruent to QS, then we have enough information to state that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle QRS. Remember, the order of those congruency statement matters. We know that AB is the same as QR, so those should be in the same position in that statement, and that follows through all the way as far as where the letters go. So making sure those are in the right order will matter, especially if these are rotated in any way. Side, angle, side, you have right, 2 corresponding sides congruent and the included angle. So what I mean by that, let's draw a picture here. We have this triangle. We'll call it again ABC. And then we have this triangle. We'll call it again QRS. The included angle, what I mean by that is the angle between the 2 sides that are marked congruent. So if AB is marked congruent to QR and BC is marked congruent to RS, then the angle that's congruent is this angle right here between those 2. All right. So if you see a side, an angle, and then a side marked congruent to that side, angle, side, then you can say that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle QRS by side, angle, side. All right, this one would be by side, side, side. So you have to state the reason that they are congruent. Okay, last one, angle, side, angle, and this is why. So the side is between the 2 corresponding angles. So one side between. So between the 2 corresponding angles are all congruent. Again, looking at a picture of what that looks like. Let's just kind of, we'll still use ABC, but let's flip. Let's flip that over so you can see it's the same. So angle, side, angle, again, it will be in that order. So let's say angle A is marked congruent to angle Q. Angle B is marked congruent to angle R. So notice I upped the number of arches that I use inside that angle. We don't want to say that it's congruent to angle A without knowing that. And then angle C is congruent to angle S. Oh, sorry. That is true, but it doesn't prove triangles congruent, so we don't need to know that. Okay, so you have those 2 angles, If we are also then given the side in between those, so essentially the side that connects them, then we can prove these triangles congruent. So AB and QR are marked congruent. Then we have angle, side, angle, angle, side, angle. And we can make that same statement as above. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle QRS. Even if you aren't told in the directions, always mark your picture with the given information. That way you can see which postulate you're using to prove these congruent, if you can use any at all. Mark any other information that you can based on the picture. So can you use your reflexive property? Do they share a side? Every side is automatically congruent to itself. So if you have two triangles and they share a side, then this line is automatically congruent to itself. So keep that in mind as you're marking things congruent. Also, we know that vertical angles are congruent. So if you have your two triangles, and you had some of this in your assignment from yesterday, we know automatically that those vertical angles are congruent. It doesn't need to be told to us at this point. You should just know that and be able to mark it. And then last, look for parallel lines. We know that if we have parallel lines, we have alternate interior angles, corresponding angles, etc., that we can mark congruent. So look for those relationships inside your diagram if you have parallel lines. All right, then you need to decide if the triangle can be proven congruent by one of the triangle congruency shortcuts. We will learn 2 more today, so you'll have 5 total. It has to fit those patterns in order to prove it congruent. Proving all 3 angles, for example, congruent isn't good enough because, well, for example, this rectangle and this rectangle have all 4 the same angles. They're very clearly not the same. So do you have 3 sides marked congruent, a side, an angle, and then a side, or an angle, a side, and an angle marked congruent in that order that you can then state clearly, okay, these are equal, and there's no way they're not. Okay, so for example, decide whether these are congruent. If so, state your reason and write your congruent statement. That's just triangle blank is congruent to triangle blank. So that's your goal here. So mark your picture. So AC is congruent to DE. So I give each of those a mark. We're going to increase that number of marks as you go up if you have more than one side. Angle A is congruent to angle E. And then angle C is congruent to angle D. All right, so you can color code if you need to, if it's helpful, but always increase the number of marks that you give as you get new information. Well, we can see here now, we have an angle and then a side and then an angle that are marked congruent, okay? That side must be sandwiched between those 2 angles. It has to touch both of them for this to work. So, yes, enough information by angle, side, angle, triangle, and we have to match these up here, so A goes with E. Triangle A, C, B is congruent with triangle, same order, E, then I go to D, and then I go to F. All right, these can be rearranged, but then these also have to be rearranged. Okay, so go ahead and try to do B, keeping in mind that XZ is congruent to itself. I don't know why I gave that 2. Right, XZ is congruent to itself. So keep that in mind and give that one a try. Actually, there's 4 down here, so I'll do this one. Sorry. So angle WXZ, so WXZ is this angle right here. This angle here is congruent with YXZ. So it's congruent with this one. They look 90 degrees. I'm not going to make that assumption though. And then WZ, this side here, and YZ are congruent. All right. So I have an angle, a side, and a side. An angle, a side, and a side. That's not one of the reasons that we have, right? It has to be a side, 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 a side angle, and then a side, or an angle, a side, and an angle. So again, looking at this, I have angle, side, side. All right, this is bad. That never works, okay? The angle has to be sandwiched between those for this to work, all right? So we used our reflexive property here. We got everything marked, but there is not congruent because there's no SSA, I'm going to flip that around, rule. Okay? That's not a reason to prove it congruent. All right, so decide whether the triangles are congruent, state the reason, and write the congruent statement. I want you to go ahead and try C on your own. It's real similar to the one I just did. I'll mark the picture for you. So PQ is congruent to RS, PS is congruent to RQ, and keep in mind by reflexive property, PR is congruent to PR. So it's congruent to itself. We'll be able to use that. All right. So is that congruent? Write your congruent statement if so. Let's look at one that's a little bit different. So let's look down here. Just a reminder, this one and this one are congruent because they're vertical. Okay, and go ahead and mark the rest of that picture and write your congruency statement if it gives you enough. These pictures are already marked for you. AD is congruent to AB. DC or CD is congruent to CB. We know this is congruent to itself. So these are congruent by side, side, side. And we can make the statement that DAC is then congruent to triangle. And you have to go in the same order. I went 1 and then down to 3. So I have to go BA to C. Right? Something to help with that, you know that in congruent triangles, those angles are corresponding. So when they share angles like that, those need to be lined up. Right? Right, and then F again is real similar to one we've already done. So go ahead and try that on your own. Do your best on these. Remember that it has to be one of those 3 reasons. So mark your picture and then say it out loud in the order that it's marked and see if it fits that pattern.